my book on this area in all of Central Virginia started because I actually used to be an insurance accident investigator, an insurance claims person, and my territory out of Richmond was the territory nobody wanted, and that was everything between the west side of Richmond and the Blue Ridge Parkway. Okay, so when I had my choice between going to downtown Richmond every day to look at cars and accident scenes and that, or riding out in the country, I decided to ride out in the country. So I did that for 3 or 4 years, and I got interested in this campaign out here because I would see all these historical markers, and they mentioned the 1781 campaign, or Cornwallis, or Lafayette. So long story short, I've written now 2 articles, a chapter in a book, and a book about that campaign. And the reason I did that is because all of the maps that were in previous books I discovered were wrong. A lot of the details were wrong, and if they even talked about this campaign between Portsmouth, Virginia, and Charlottesville, and from Fredericksburg to Petersburg, if they even talked about it, it was in about 2 paragraphs, and they got all the details wrong. So I said, well, I'm out there anyway, I might as well start taking notes, right? So years later, I wound up turning it into a book. So that's what we'll be talking about for the most part today. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Now, the campaign originated when Lord Cornwallis, the British commander, won the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in Greensboro, North Carolina, which he did, but his losses were so heavy that he couldn't pursue Nathaniel Greene's force. So he retreated down the Cape Fear River to Wilmington by April 9th. Now, when George Washington, commanding the main Continental Army up on the Hudson River near New York, learned about several British raids in the Tidewater area of Virginia in January, March, and April of 1781, he sent Lafayette to Virginia with 1,000 Continentals from the Hudson River, and they walked all the way down to this area. Okay, 1,000 Continental Light Infantrymen, and they were supposed to be supported by Virginia militia troops. Now, but the British decided in April of 1781 to move into Virginia to destroy Virginia's supplies, their recruiting capabilities, and their ability to manufacture and repair arms and bayonets and camp kettles and tents and everything an army needs in the Carolinas. That's where the war was being fought, in North and South Carolina. So Cornwallis said, well, if we're going to really conquer North and South Carolina, we got to wipe out the logistics network, or as they say today, the logistical tail of Greene's army in Virginia. So that's why he marched his men, about 1,450 redcoats, from Wilmington, North Carolina, to Petersburg, Virginia. There he arrived around May 15th, some forces as late as May 20th, 1781. And that began, when he got to Petersburg, Virginia, that's really when this campaign kicks off. Part of the British troops at the time were led by Benedict Arnold, who, once Lafayette came down from New York, he realized that if I get caught, things aren't going to be very fun for me on the low end of the rope. So he went back to Portsmouth and eventually sailed back to New York. That left at Petersburg, Cornwallis, and roughly, it's a little hard to tell for sure, but roughly 5,000 British troops. All right, let's go to the next slide. Now, when Cornwallis, you can see the Petersburg down there below with the yellow dot. When Cornwallis got to Petersburg, about the 4th week in May, he moved all of his forces down the James River to a spot right there where you see the arrow pointing, and crossed the James River at Westover Plantation on the James River, the north side of the plantation. Lafayette had reached Richmond by April 29th with his 1,000 men, and they sought to guard Richmond, the capital, but also keep an eye on Cornwallis. The problem was Cornwallis had 5,000 to 5,500 redcoats, and Lafayette had 1,000 Continentals and a handful of militia who were very unreliable. So Lafayette's maneuvers were always based on the notion that he had to have some kind of natural barrier between himself and Cornwallis until he was reinforced. And of course, in this area of Virginia, the natural barriers are the rivers. Okay? So once Cornwallis crossed over the James and was on the same side of the river as Lafayette, Lafayette decided that discretion is the better part of valor, and that he was going to move northward to meet expected reinforcements coming from Pennsylvania under General Anthony Wayne. Have you all heard of Man Anthony Wayne? Okay, he was not actually called Man Anthony during the Revolutionary War. Okay? Just little side note there. That was later. So Lafayette starts to move northward, and Cornwallis basically moved up like he was heading to Fredericksburg. And Lafayette always remained a little bit north and a little bit west, about 20 miles at all times. And some of the places I have here on the screen, some of you have probably been to Malvern Hill Battlefield before, down near Richmond. That was actually a plantation at the time. And Cornwallis moved his troops from Westover to Malvern Hill, up to Bottoms Bridge. That's where currently, if you know where the Richmond Airport is, US 60, when it goes toward Williamsburg, when it crosses the Chickahominy, that's Bottoms Bridge. And eventually up to Hanover Courthouse. Lafayette kept moving a little bit out of the way to guard, to make sure that he wasn't going to be defeated. There letter after letter from Lafayette to Nathaniel Greene in South Carolina, and Cornwallis in Washington North, saying, I don't have enough men even to get beaten on a battlefield. I can't even risk anything by even trying to face off with Cornwallis. So he didn't. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so the area that we're going to be talking about the most with today in this group is what you see here between Charlottesville, Richmond, and not quite Fredericksburg. So Cornwallis eventually wound up where the X is, that's Cook's Ford. That's on the North Anna River. In the Civil War, it was called Oxford, and it shows up on all the maps of the Overland Campaign from 1864. But in the 18th century, it was known as Cook's Ford, and that is located about 5 miles west of King's Dominion. Okay? King's Dominion was not around in the Revolution, even though it says King's in the name. It's not a colonial amusement park. Okay? So that's about as far north on the North Anna River, right where Route 1 crosses the North Anna River. That's where Cook's Ford is, and of course Doswell, where King's Dominion is, just 5 miles away. So he got out there with his men, and by this time, Lafayette had crossed the South Anna River, the North Anna River, and the Rappahannock, the Rapidan, and we're going to be talking about that in a good bit of detail because it involves Orange County in a little while. And Cornwallis decided that he had gotten far north. He was only about 40 miles, only about 25, 30 miles from Fredericksburg. And Fredericksburg was where Virginia's main manufacturing location was for arms and equipment. If you know Fredericksburg, there's a little town right across the Rappahannock River called Falmouth. And that's where the forge was, and Hunter's Iron Works. That was all there. But by Lafayette retreating northward, Cornwallis knew, I don't want to get in your way, that with Lafayette off the map, everything over this way was now open to seizure and capture and destruction. And so the Americans had supply depots at Charlottesville, Point of Fork. Does anybody know where Point of Fork is? It's where the Rivanna River from Charlottesville hits the James River. There used to be a town, well, there is a town there, it's called Columbia. It was for sale about 10 or 12 years ago, the entire town. And that's where the depot was. Another location called Seven Islands in the James River in Fluvanna County. So Cornwallis decided, I'm going to go out that way. So he left Lafayette alone, and Cornwallis basically moved from Cook's Ford to Ground Squirrel Bridge. Okay, it's still called that. That's where US 33 in Hanover County crosses the South Anna River. That's Ground Squirrel Bridge. And then eventually moved down to Point of Fork to destroy that area. At the same time, you might be familiar with Charlton. How many of you, and don't be ashamed to admit this, how many of you watched the movie The Patriot? It's okay, raise your hands, I'm not going to call on you. Okay, worst history movie in the world. Absolutely. In fact, I could come back for another 4-hour session maybe next year. We'll talk about everything that's wrong with The Patriot. However, one of the characters was Colonel Tavington. Remember him, the evil guy? He was based on Tarleton. And Tarleton was a young, brash cavalry commander for the British that Cornwallis sent on a raid from Cook's Ford to Charlottesville. And who do you think was in Charlottesville that was very interesting to Tarleton? Thomas Jefferson. The state assembly had moved from Richmond to Charlottesville to get out of the way of Cornwallis. But Tarleton went on an overnight raid. He stopped at this little crossroads in Louisa County that's now called Cuckoo Tavern. It was not called that at the time of the Revolution. And then there's this legend of the Paul Revere of the South, Jack Jouett. He sees Tarleton and his men at the tavern, says, I wonder what 180 British dragoons are out in the middle of the night riding west for, figures it out, leaves the tavern, and rushes all the way to Charlottesville, warns Jefferson. Jefferson gets out. He warns the state assembly. All but 7 of them flew like birds all over the place, except one of the 7 was captured and held overnight because he wasn't regarded as a gentleman, and his name was Daniel Boone. Okay? The assembly later reconvened about 8 days later in Stanton, okay? County seat of Augusta County. So that's all what's going on, but Lafayette's keeping out of this because he realizes until Wayne gets down from Pennsylvania with his 1,000 troops, he's really not going to be able to do much at all. Boswell's Tavern, anybody ever been out to Boswell's Tavern? It's not that far from here. It's right on 15. We're 15 and, what's the crossroad? Is that 22, I think? 22, right. So Tarleton went to Boswell's Tavern. Eventually the British moved back to Richmond by June 16th, and they were followed by Lafayette. But this is a whole nother story here. It involves Goochland as well, and a lot of Hanover. That's an image of Tarleton. It was done, an engraving done from a portrait that's now in the National Portrait Gallery in London. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, now, one of the last river Lafayette had to cross was the Rapidan. And there is a question about where he crossed the Rapidan. Okay? Now, he needed to retreat to avoid Cornwallis and the larger army and meet up with Wayne's troops, hopefully on the way, and to continue to keep obstacles between himself and the British troops. This was his goal, is to not get defeated. The final river he crossed, as I mentioned, is the Rapidan. And really, in Lafayette's correspondence, much of the information we get from this whole time period is from Lafayette's correspondence and from Cornwallis's correspondence, Tarleton's memoirs after the war. Another cavalry commander that destroyed Point of Fork was John Graves Simcoe with the Queen's Rangers. His diary, he actually wrote 2 diaries, a diary and a journal. I don't think the first one sold, so we've revamped it. And I'm thinking about adopting that for some of my own work, too, by the way. So that's where we get a lot of this information, but also Virginia state records that are published and others that are non-published as well. All right, let's move on. Now, has anybody seen this sign? This is right across from Grant's headquarters at Wilderness Battlefield, and it was put in within the last probably 10 years, 12 years, and it says that, I actually highlighted it, but I don't think it came through. It says, in the campaign of 1781, the Marquis de Lafayette marched through the wilderness to rendezvous with Brigadier General Mad Anthony Wayne, period. So far, so good, okay? He was coming up from Caroline County, Spotsylvania. If you know where Todd's Tavern is in Spotsylvania, it's part of the battlefield, up Brock Road, and he encamped for one night at the house there. It's called Elwood. It was during the Civil War, they used to refer to it as the Lacey House, but it's really Elwood, and they camped in the fields there along Wilderness Run, and from there, they moved across the Rapidan. That's where it gets a little interesting. On the 3rd of June, Lafayette's army camped south of the Wilderness Bridge, right? Across the Wilderness Run from Elwood, still fine. The next day, Lafayette reconnoitered Ely's Ford while the army crossed Germanna Ford to reach Culpeper Church. Uh-oh, that's where the problem is, okay? Afterward, Lafayette, marching south, recrossed the Rapidan River during his Grand American Tour, and on about 1824. Okay, so this theory is that the troops marched across Germanna Ford to get across the Rapidan and get away. The only problem is there's really not much evidence to say that that is true. Okay, so let's move over to the next slide. And here I'm gonna if you all can see this. So Corbin's Bridge in Spotsylvania, that's still marked, by the way. Lafayette came up the Brock Road to the Wilderness Bridge, and that's where, I'm sure you know this, that's where the what I call the nuclear-powered Sheetz gas station is located. You know, the big red one. It's got to be run by nuclear power. It's the only thing in Orange County that you can see from space. Okay, so that intersection there, right? If you keep taking 3 up toward, like you're heading toward Culpeper, you cross at Germanna. Back then it was Germanna Ford. Civil War, they put pontoon bridges, but that's where that sign says that Lafayette's troops went. Now, this is Ely's Ford, okay, and Fredericksburg. This is roughly Route 3, right, to the battlefield, and then south toward where we are. Ely's Ford is on the Rapidan directly north of the Chancellorsville Battlefield Visitor Center. So if you went in a straight line and hit the Rapidan, that's where Ely's Ford is, give or take half a mile one way or the other. This map was done by Lafayette's engineers about 2 or 3 years after the campaign, and it was designed to go along with Lafayette's memoirs. Okay? Not too many people who are 26-year-old are writing their memoirs and commissioning maps. And it shows, as you see that yellow line, it shows Lafayette's troops crossing at Germanna Ford. Okay? This is the only piece of evidence that indicates a Germanna Ford crossing. There's nothing else. Okay? Again, this was done after the fact by engineers who were not in the campaign. This map is a very large map in real life. There's one at the Society of the Cincinnati in Washington. There's one at Yale University Library. There's one at Colonial Williamsburg. And in the foyer of the Boswell Tavern House, there used to be one also, although I think that was a reproduction. I don't think that was an original. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Theory 2, my theory, is the correct one. Okay? So this is Ely's Ford Road. If you know where the Chancellor, you all know where the Chancellorsville Battlefield is. So when you get to the intersection where the Chancellor ruins are, if you turn off 3 and go north, right there at the ruins, that's Ely's Ford Road, and it winds around several miles, and it crosses, and it's much more famous for being a Civil War crossing of the Union Army during the Chancellorsville and the Wilderness campaigns. Okay, the red dot over there is second prize Germanna Ford. okay? And I've marked Wilderness Run right down in there. Okay, so why do I think it's Ely's Ford? First of all, one of the greatest resources for historians, genealogists, interested people, local historical societies, is that in the 1830s, early 1830s, the federal government ran a surplus. Can you imagine that? And let me pause right there so you get that, okay? A surplus. And who was who was our first president that hated the government, thought it was all waste and wanted to make it as small as possible?
Andrew Jackson.
Andrew Jackson, exactly. Which ironically, he's on the $20 bill, right? He hated paper currency too. So what the Congress decided to do is offer Revolutionary War veterans a pension, okay? The ones who were still around in the 1830s. And in order to, now they didn't have, who's ever been in the service here knows what a DD-214 is, but it's your military record. They didn't have military records like that. And these guys weren't keeping militia pay stubs 50 years after the fact, right? So you had to go in and swear in front of a judge and bring witnesses or affidavits of service, and in order to prove that you were in a campaign, what people did was to say, well, I was in a company that mustered in Orange County at the courthouse, led by John Williams. He was a captain. His brother was Michael Williams. He was the major. And then we marched to Portsmouth and back to Caroline County, blah, 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 blah. Right? You had to make it as detailed as possible, as convincing as possible. And those records all exist today. And they're all online. So, and most of them, many of them, not enough, but many of them have been transcribed so that you can go on sites where the records are transcribed and do keyword searches. So one of the keyword searches I did was what? Ely's Ford. Boom, 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 boom. Lots of hits, okay? And so some of them, I'll read a few of these to you, just so you get the idea. And these guys don't necessarily have to have been from Orange County. Here's a pension application. January 1781. In that month, Enoch Breeden was drafted into the service and remained in the service, performing his own tour and as the substitutes of his two brothers. So his two brothers didn't want to go and paid him to take their tours. I'm assuming they were older brothers. That sounds like an older brother thing, doesn't it? Until the latter end of October in that year, 1781. In this tour, the regiment joined General Stevens, a militia general, command at 4 Mile Creek in Henrico County. They retreated from the British to Hanover and Spotsylvania counties into Culpeper County, crossing the Rappahannock at, drumroll, Ely's Ford. Okay? The whole under the command of General Lafayette. They recrossed the river into Orange County at what ford? What's the most famous ford in Orange County over the river? Raccoon Ford. Okay, I can tell you, if you put in Raccoon Ford into these databases, you get hundreds and hundreds of hits. Everyone in 1781, no matter where they were from in Virginia during this campaign, they all mentioned Raccoon Ford. It was the easiest to find. It was an approved Ford. In order to remove, every river has a bank. Some are high, some are low. But in order for an army to cross a river, the approach to it, meaning the decline to the river from the bank, with engineers, has to be dug out so the horses can go down and get up on the other side with wagons, artillery, ammunition boxes, things like that. And Raccoon Ford was really very well known. Very well known. It appears all the time. Another pension application, this one from William Leckie. I entered the service in place of Edmund Herndon, again another substitute. Served a 3-month tour. I marched from the county of Caroline under the command of Captain James Outlaw, love that name, right? Colonel Matthews commanded the regiment. I joined the Army a few miles from Scotchtown, Patrick Henry's house in Hanover County. The Army then retreated to Ely's Ford upon the Rappahannock River, the British pursuing. Now, this last one, this is probably the most convincing, and that's because it was written by Edward Ely. Okay? No coincidence. No coincidence whatsoever. The third term I was drafted for the service, I hired a substitute who filled my place, and he was in General Lafayette's army when they passed on by Ely's Ford. If anybody knew it was Ely's Ford, it was going to be Edward Ely, right? In Culpeper, by circuitous route through Spotsylvania County and into Culpeper in order to strengthen his army. And he joined, I think, Morgan's army at the Fork Church in Culpeper County and crossed over the river again, the Rapid End River at Raccoon Ford into Orange County. Okay? So there are four or five of those. There's also a letter from Lafayette to Greene dated June 4th, the day the Army crossed at Ely's Ford, that is posted with the date and location, Ely's Ford. Now, if you look at the map, if you're writing a letter from this side of Ely's Ford, you're not going to go way back and go to Germanna Ford and cross at all. So he made a circuitous route over to that. And then finally, there's one letter that has been routinely overlooked from one Virginia militia commander to another in Fredericksburg, and the guy's writing from Ely's Ford, and he says, we're going to cross at Ely's Ford. Okay? Now, why hasn't that been seen in Lafayette's papers, in the Virginia papers, Continentals? Because that letter was captured by Tarleton, and Tarleton passed it on to Cornwallis. And then in the British Army records, they stuck that in the files, and it was sitting in the British Public Record Office for 222 years until it was discovered by a researcher, and it shows exactly that he was there. One more thing about Edward Ely. He writes, I should have said this a second ago. He talks about the Army and says, he remembers distinctly as some 50 or 60 of Lafayette's officers and soldiers called upon him, and he gave them their dinner, that he killed 4 or 5 lambs for the occasion, and they were cooking and eating until night from common dinner time. They then left in pursuit of the army. What does that tell us? The historical marker said that Lafayette made a reconnaissance of Ely's Ford, everybody else went to Germanna. Well, you don't make a reconnaissance with 50 or 60 guys who then stop and beg for dinner from Mr. Ely. And then what does he say? Where were they going? They went to follow the rest of the army, which means the rest of the army had crossed at Ely's Ford. Okay? So as a side, I wrote to the Virginia Department of Historic Resources and said, can you give me, because this is a fairly new marker, can you give me the research file for that? And so there's a wonderful woman down there named Jennifer Lou, L-O-U-X. She sent it to me. And within about 5 days, as my daughter told me, she thinks Jennifer dreaded my emails when she got to work every morning because I'd find more information, right? I'd find all these pension applications and maps. And I wanted them to change the sign, of course, right? Exactly. But at least she put all my research. They were convinced that I was correct and put all that stuff in there. Now, the rest of that marker is fine. It's very good. And you can't always get these things right. Okay? So I don't want to criticize the group that put that together. And I'll tell you that story in a second. All right, let's go to the next. Everybody can. How many people vote with my theory? Okay, show of hands. Yeah. How many people vote on that terrible Germanna Ford theory? Okay, good. All right. I'm going to tell Jennifer Lou that on Monday. All right. So this is a picture of Ely's Ford. That's the road bridge. That's Ely's Ford Road. This is looking from the south bank to the north bank. One thing about fords, though, to remember, and how many of you have been to Raccoon Ford? Okay, it's very easy to go. It's easy to get there, but you got to go on the Culpeper side instead of the orange side. It's a little harder to see from the orange side. But this is the ford here. Next slide, please. Okay, now let's get back to Anthony Wayne. Anthony Wayne brought down 1,000 Pennsylvania Continentals in 3 regiments from York. Actually, they started Morristown, New Jersey, moved to York, Pennsylvania. They were delayed at York because of a mutiny over pay and terms of service. That's a whole different story. They had already previously mutinied at Morristown, and they were rescheduled, re-upped. Half of them went home. They got to York. At the mutiny in York, Wayne said, "We're not going through this again. We're not doing this a third time. This is it." So they got 10 of the ringleaders, brought them in front of the troops, shot 5 of them, and then let the other 5 go in front of the entire army. No more problems after that. Okay, and his route was York, Pennsylvania, Frederick, Maryland, down the Monocacy River to a place to cross the Potomac River, a place called Nolan's Ferry. If you've ever gone up toward Gettysburg, Frederick, if you take US 15 and go to Haymarket, Leesburg, Luckett's, and you cross the river at Point of Rocks, Nolan's Ferry is about 8 miles down, and it's still a public boat launch on the Maryland side. Now, another question was, where did his column join Lafayette's force? All right, I think I haven't. Let's look at the next slide. I might have a map of this. No. Okay. It was in Orange County, so you all can cheer Orange County. This fact is made a big mistake in so many books. The date and the location. And all you have to do is read the correspondence of Lafayette, Wayne, and the troops coming down with Wayne were all Pennsylvanians. They were the officers were very well educated, and they left a lot of their letters and diaries back. And it tells you every single day where they camped, how far they went, and what the weather was like. And it's now indisputable that June 10th was the date that they were that they met up together. And all the soldiers say they met on the road, meaning south of Raccoon Ford, on the way to Boswell's Tavern, somewhere probably about 6-7 miles below Raccoon Ford, on what's now the Marquis Road. Okay. All right. We talked about the junction. All forces then proceeded to Boswell's Tavern by June 11th. Lafayette actually got there in advance on June 10th. And when you research this and read it, and when you read it in my book, and after having purchased multiple copies of it for yourselves, having done all that research, I really just wanted to see a letter from Lafayette saying, "Wayne and I embraced in our success, and now on toward the British." He doesn't even mention it. Doesn't even mention it. Wow. Wayne doesn't mention it either. There's no record of the two of them meeting. It's kind of anticlimactic, but okay. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so here's our map. Raccoon Ford. There's where 522 crosses the river there. Now, for most of US 522 in this area, it is a modern road. It does not sit and lay on the roadbed of an 18th century road. Okay, it does not do that. So the Wayne had to figure out a way, and Lafayette had to figure out a way to get farther toward Charlottesville and Boswell's Tavern. So they crossed there and then went to Rhodesville. Okay, and there's an historical marker right at that crossroads at Rhodesville. Now you can go down Raccoon Ford Road right down there, and there's a building at the end of that at the car park right there, and that was a post office through the Civil War. A little bit after that, tiny building, and you can turn around, but we learned the hard way about 10 years ago. It's hard for a 57-person bus to do that, but anybody's car can do it. We did it. We got out of there. But you can see it right there in the riverbank. Again, what I started talking about earlier on Fords, there's no one location of a Ford, even though it keeps its same name. Every time there's a flood, every time there's some kind of weather thing or whatever, it's the shoals to make it fordable across the river, that's going to change from year to year or decade to decade. But it's all right, basically in the same place. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so on Raccoon Ford, they finally got down to Rhodesville, and then moved over to Unionville, and from Unionville down south, there is a road that's now called Marquis Road, and that road was the road that would have been taken from Raccoon Ford down towards western Louisa, where Boswell's Tavern is. Okay? Okay.
Can you, where is Boswell's Tavern?
It's at the intersection of US 15 and 22. So if you go from Zion's Crossroads directly north on 15, you will eventually get to a traffic light where 22 east-west, you stop there, and if you make a right like you're heading back east toward Louisa, the house is about 100 yards on the left, and it's only about 30 yards from the road. It's totally visible. And I'll show you a picture of it from the road. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so Lafayette came down, and Wayne came down Marquis Road, made that dog leg there. What was the name of that? The name of the, is it Lahore, right there. That's where that dog leg is. And this road keeps going and it crosses Brock's Bridge. This is mentioned by all the officers, many of the men. It crosses the North Anna River. Now back in Hanover, the North Anna River is probably 30 yards across, 4 feet deep, with huge, very steep banks. But here, the cows are walking across it all day long. It's very shallow and very small. But that bridge is right there on Marquis Road. And from Brock's Bridge, Lafayette and the troops went to Boswell's Tavern, but it is not known exactly what that route was. It's just too hard to figure out. There's not enough landmarks in here. Some of the Pennsylvania officers who were keeping diaries along the way, all the way from the Potomac River all the way down here, I'm afraid I'm going to have to tell you what they said was that this region was a barren, dry place. There's nothing here, few houses, piney woods, nothing to drink, squalid, never want to come back. Okay? Not from the Culpeper Tourism Board, right? All right, so let's move on to the next slide.
Can I ask you a question?
Yep.
And forgive me if you already told us, how many men, so Lafayette had 1,000 men, how many did Wayne?
1,000.
Another 1,000, so we're now 2,000.
Plus they were joined somewhere just south of Raccoon Ford by about 1,500 militia, Virginia militiamen,
Okay.
under General Lawson, General Whedon, who was from Fredericksburg.
Okay, but we're still facing British of 5,000 to 5,500?
Who were down on the James River.
Okay.
Yep, near, okay. All right, so just to finish up here, the rest of the campaign, Cornwallis went back to Richmond, got there by the 16th, left on the 20th. They're heading back toward Portsmouth to get resupplied. They hadn't been resupplied in about 4 months as far as uniforms and things like that. Shoes, even the British were in bare feet. And moved down, they fought 2 battles. June 26th, the Battle of Spencer's Ordinary, west of Williamsburg. As long as we're on the subject of historical markers, the historical markers had the wrong date for that battle since it was installed in 1936. I told Jennifer about that too. I haven't heard back from her yet, but that was 4 or 5 years ago. I'm sure she's busy. I'm kidding about that. Then the Battle of Green Spring, right near Jamestown Plantation. The British crossed the James River to Cobham, wound up going to Portsmouth, Norfolk, and from Norfolk they started looking for a new Navy base. and they found one called Yorktown, and I'm going to leave it at that. I don't want to ruin the ending for you. Okay? Okay. Is that my last slide? Let's see.
No.
Okay. This is just a cutout from a book, a map here, just showing kind of the British motions and what you have. So anyway, to get back to Lafayette and Wayne here, Lafayette, even though Lafayette had 2,000 Continentals and Cornwallis had 5, Cornwallis started to get wary around that point. And they were at Elk Hill, which is on the James River in the far western part of Goochland County, and that was a Jefferson property. And he bought that from Jefferson bought that from his sister-in-law who inherited that. And that actually is a place you could actually get on and see. The house is not there anymore, but the grounds are. And so with Cornwallis had to get back to resupply. He was very extended. And Lafayette and his men moved from Boswell's Tavern to a little creek called Meechunk Creek. And that Meechunk Creek runs from the north to the south, eventually to the Ravenna. But the main road from Richmond to Charlottesville crosses that bridge. That's the Three Chop Road. So Lafayette took up a position on the far side, I mean the west side of Three Chop Road, to prevent any further British actions toward Charlottesville, Point of Fork, and other depots. From that time, that was June 11th and 12th, from that time, Cornwallis was no longer advancing, he was retreating. And Lafayette took a road above the Three Chop Road, and Cornwallis was on the River Road, Route 6, State Route 6. And Lafayette kept writing back to Washington, every time he moves, I move with him, and it looks like I'm chasing him. I mean, he knew that he had to make it look like Cornwallis turned tail and was getting away from him. By this time, too, he was joined by over 100 riflemen who were firing much more accurate, deadly rifles at the British. And these had been all called out by Jefferson from what was called the rifle counties. And the rifle counties were in the Shenandoah Valley. So it was Rockingham, Augusta, Rockbridge, Fincastle, Bedford County. They started to join in by the time of those other two battles, Green Spring and Spencer's Ordinary. There were a lot of them. But to get from Boswell's Tavern to that bridge over Meechunk Creek, the story is universally given as we cleared an unused road, or we cleared an old road, or a disguised passage. And there's a marker near Boswell's Tavern that says they did that, but it's unknown where that road is. There's no trace of it anymore. I think it probably went from Boswell's, and on 15, as you go south from that Boswell's intersection toward Zion Crossroads, it was to the west of that. And there's a Lake Louisa in there. I think a lot of that kind of disturbed the road, but somehow they were able to do that. When I was doing in the book and everything I've told you about, I've been on all of those roads. I rode up and down all the time trying to figure out where these go. And I noticed that to talk about the bridge and where he was blocking, Lafayette was blocking Tarleton and Cornwallis, the historical marker was placed 12 miles north of where it should have been. So this is the first time Jennifer started hearing from me in our tumultuous relationship. I'll leave it at that. And so I said, hey, the marker's in the wrong place, right? So she, and I'm paraphrasing here, she said, prove it, okay? I don't blame her, right? She didn't know who Joanna, but I had literally just written the book on all these motions. So I had this much proof for her, faxed it to her, this is back when we had a fax machine, faxed it to her, and then, I'm expecting her to call me by the end of the day. I'm looking at my watch, right? Here, 3 weeks later, get an email, paraphrasing, you're right. I was like, I beat the man, right? I beat the system. I won. I took the state to its knees, and now we're going to get some action. They're going to move it. So I write back, when are you guys going to move it? She writes back, we can't move historical markers. VDOT does that. I'm like, uh-oh.
Oh dear.
All I heard is VDOT, bad news, right? So I said, okay. I'll keep my cool here. So about 4 months later, out of the blue, she writes, VDOT is going to move the marker. Where do you want it? Okay? Oh, there we're talking. Right? History in action. Right? So I said to her, I know exactly where I want it. So it's on US 250. If you're coming out of Charlottesville, on 250, you go by Shadwell, and you start heading down east toward Goochland. There's a part where the original Three Chop Road crosses US 250 and goes to that bridge, and it's on 250 right there.
Awesome.
So anyway, does anybody have any questions about the campaign or Lafayette or what happened? Yes, ma'am.
What is VDOT?
Virginia Department of Transportation. So the Highway Department. So the Historical Resources Department or Division, they're not funded for going out there and moving signs. And today, I don't know, you probably may know this, you see a lot of new ones going up, especially related to African American communities and churches and colonial stuff. And now that the 250th of the Revolutionary War, you're going to see a lot more stuff. But those cast aluminum signs cost about $2,000 a piece.
Three.
And the state, yeah.
I just bought one.
Yep, and the state doesn't pay for it either, right? You're thinking, hey, state, it's a historical mark for the state. How come you're not paying for it? They don't pay for them at all. And
Has to be sponsored
yep.
by a group that wants it.
And my question is, so Lafayette is actually moving, like originally moving a little bit down, and that is like closer towards, actually like from what I understood, it's like crossing the river, but getting closer actually to the British Army.
He did once he was joined by Anthony Wayne's troops, and he had more
And
troops.
Anthony came
Then he
from-
started to come back
from,
down again.
Like the northern Virginia area, right?
Right.
And they together were like trying to catch the British troops.
They hoped to, but the British were still way too strong, and it wasn't until really during the whole campaign, those last two battles of Green Spring and Spencer's Ordinary. Those are the only two battles that were fought. They were only fought with partial detachments of the army, not the whole thing. So they never really actually had much of a fighting between the two of them, between the British and Lafayette.
And last question, so the river flows from this up or this down?
The river flows from the west down east toward the Chesapeake Bay.
So this way. Like, why the British, they didn't control the river? If they took control of the river, like it's
So they couldn't bring up shipping past Richmond. Ships can't go past Richmond. Large ships, because that's the fall line, which means that's where all the rapids are, where the rocks are. So in Richmond, on the James, you can't go past Richmond. On the Appomattox, you can't go past Petersburg. The Potomac, you can't go past Georgetown, Fredericksburg, and Falmouth. Yes, ma'am.
So in the Committee of Safety ledger books for this period of time, it seems that Lafayette was camped for about a week at Raccoon Ford hosted by former Congressman, then again Congressman, Charles Porter at his plantation, Tudor Hall. And he was still waiting for Wayne. That's why they decided to, camp there, wash their clothes, and just rest from all the marching around. So and then my understanding is they broke that camp when they had to go respond to Cornwallis's actions at Point of Fork. But I could be wrong about that. I'm wondering what.
I think a week is not. That's a little long. They crossed the Rapid End at Ely's Ford on June 4th, and they crossed at least Lafayette's troops crossed the Raccoon Ford somewhere around June 7th. Started moving south a little bit. Wayne and his troops met up with them at Raccoon Ford on the 10th.
Okay.
So I doubt it was
So
a
a
week.
week is a little long.
I think so.
But the nucleus of the story about what the Committee of Safety for Orange County was paying for guards and the fences that were torn down for firewood and all of that nucleus is correct.
So, somewhere in the neighborhood of the 6th through the 10th.
Yeah, that works.
Yep.
Okay, and then so why, when they broke camp there, where did they go?
At Raccoon Ford,
Mm-hmm.
they went to Boswell's Tavern.
Okay. Not to Point of Fork.
The Americans never got to the Point of Fork. The British captured the Point of Fork from an American force led by Baron von
Von
Steuben.
Steuben, yeah.
Yep.
All right, so they went to Boswell's Tavern and then did what?
From Boswell's Tavern, they went to that creek location on Meechunk Creek.
Thank you very much.
Yep. Yes, sir.
Any connection between Greene and Lafayette?
Yes. So when Lafayette was ordered down south by Washington in February of 1781, he was supposed to put himself under Greene's orders. But when they realized that how much of a British force had arrived in Virginia, up and down the James, from the mouth of the James to Petersburg and Richmond, then Washington said, stay in this area and we'll reinforce you with Wayne's troops.
Okay, so there was no real interaction.
Only letters,
But, okay.
yeah, but they never served together during this campaign.
Did they serve together at any point during the war?
Yes, in 1780, right. Greene left West Point, New York in October of 1780 to go down to the Carolinas, and then he never served again up in the northern part. Yes, sir.
You mentioned von Steuben at Point of Rocks. So what did von Steuben have? How many troops did he have?
At Point of Fork.
Point of Fork.
Point of Fork, that's where the depot was. So he had about 400 what they were called new levies, which means they were recruited for continental service in Virginia, and he was using them to guard and then train them.
Okay.
And the British came upon Point of Fork. I'm not sure if I have, can you go back? Keep going. Right, so, there you go. So this is Point of Fork down here. This is where the Rivanna River and the James come together. And there was a big supply depot there. They manufactured things, leather, things along those lines. It's listed on the Virginia Register of Historical Places. There's some foundations of buildings there, but you can't access it. It's on private property.
Point of Fork being now Columbia,
That's where Columbia is, where the two rivers come together. Right, right.
So what happened to von Steuben's men?
So when Simcoe approached, von Steuben tried to get as much as he could across the river to the south side of the James, and he was kind of tricked into thinking that the whole British army was in front of him, and so he retreated about 75 miles to Halifax County.
He got out of the way.
He did. Yes, ma'am?
I know during the siege of Yorktown, the French were fighting with us in the final assault. At this point, with this force of like 3,500 men, it sounds like, are the French involved at that point, or does that come later when Washington?
That comes in September. The French came in September,
In September.
early September. Washington and Rochambeau arrived
Oh, that's right.
in the 15th of September,
Okay.
and then other troops that came up from the West Indies in late September. So the
Okay.
siege was September 28th through October 19th.
Okay, so at this point, it's American.
The French.
Yeah.
Now Lafayette had some French aides with him,
Okay,
but not serving as French officers. They were commissioned by the Continental Congress.
Was it Gimat with
thank
him?
you.
Mm-hmm.
Can you comment on Lafayette's defense of Richmond and where it occurred in this campaign?
Lafayette.
That would have been earlier, right? Because the assembly went from Richmond to Charlottesville.
Right. So Lafayette's troops arrived at Richmond on April 29th, all the way from New York, and stationed themselves on the heights of Richmond. And the very next day, the British showed up on the other side of the river at Manchester and decided that they were not going to try to force the river, and they went back to Petersburg. But there was also Arnold's raid of Richmond in January 4th and 5th,
Right.
and West Ham.
But supposedly he used scattered fire and spread of troops. It looked like there were more men than there really were.
On the heights of Richmond, right. Yes, ma'am.
Can you talk or speak to his lack of cavalry, Lafayette?
Yes, okay, so in the entire war, there was very little cavalry used by the British. They were called dragoons, basically, back then, or light horse. And the two most dangerous elements of the British Army under Cornwallis was Tarleton's Legion, which was a mixed cavalry and infantry unit, and the Queen's Rangers, which was Simcoe's command, who, if you've ever heard of Rogers Rangers from the French and Indian War, this unit grew out of that. In fact, the Queen's Rangers were also known as the 105th American Regiment, and they were on the British establishment to be able to supply them and what have you. Those two units together were made up of about 400 dragoons. And in the South, and I probably didn't stress this enough, when Greene came down from New York all the way to the Carolinas, then Lafayette came down from New York to Virginia, they quickly realized that anything beyond the Susquehanna River, they were on their own for. There was no supplies in the South. There were no manufactories really what to speak of, except for some in the Annapolis and Havre de Grace area, Hunter's Iron Works, but there was very little supplies. You can read Lafayette's papers from this campaign, Greene's papers, all through 1781. And this image of the Continental soldier with the blue regimental coat and white waistcoat and breeches with a polished musket, that existed only in their minds. That was not the case. And the officers were not exaggerating, the Pennsylvania officers, Lafayette's staff, all these folks, that some of the troops were out there in a blanket wrapped around their waist, Indian style. And that's it. Cartridge boxes were hard to come by, ammunition, muskets, it was just absolutely horrible. And part of that was an inability to raise dragoons. Virginia was still very much a horse country back then, and General Greene wrote that the Virginians were more concerned about their horse flesh than their constitutional liberties, because they would not let the purchasing agents from the Continental Army come to them and take their horses and give them worthless script or IOUs, and that if they were going to sell the horses, who was paying in hard currency? The British. Yep. That's the same thing that happened at Valley Forge. There's plenty of food around. The British were paying a lot more money for it than Washington was. So Lafayette really never had more than 60 or 70 mounted troops at one time. Yes, ma'am?
Did you want to point out the Boswell's Tavern picture came up here?
Oh, yeah. If you haven't seen it, this is Boswell's Tavern. This shed roof extension is not original, but everything between the chimneys is. The road is this way, and there's mention by both Lafayette and Tarleton's men stayed here too, briefly on their way to the Charlottesville raid, and they both mentioned there was a terrific watering hole for the horses. And all you had to do was go about 75 yards behind the house. There's a nice little pond back there, which was probably the result of the spring that was there. But this house was occupied. Sorry, El Vaquero. The house. My wife and I were on a tour there in 2008, and we got to go in the house. I led another tour in about 2012, I think, and it was for sale. So, and it's been for sale several times since then. And I wanted to make sure this bus tour people got into the house. It's it's a private residence. So I called the realtor. And I said, how would you like to have 50 showings in one day? Oh yeah, bring them on, bring them on. And then he said, I got another property that's from the 1700s, and I think you all like that better. And I said, well, what's it called? He said, Castle Hill. And Castle Hill is on the road between, Gordonsville and Shadwell, right? Is that 22? 20, okay. Now, we didn't get to go inside that one, but we got to walk around the grounds. It's actually an 1840s house, two-story brick house that's attached to a 1760s story-and-a-half colonial house. And Tarleton and his men stopped there and captured a few legislators. It was owned by
Thomas Walker.
Walker, right? And the Walker was the one that was when Jefferson wrote that as a youth I made improper advances on a young lady, which I now regret. That was Walker's wife, and Walker did not. And Walker appointed him a trustee for the estate and for her and her kids. He said, "I don't want Thomas Jefferson anywhere near me or this house." That's where that was. You can't see the house from the road at all, but we were able to get up there one time. But back to this place, we got in there. This family from Northern Virginia, they had bought it and they were fixing it up to have a weekend place and eventually move there. And the last few times my wife and I have gone by there's grass in the stones of the driveway, and it didn't look like anybody was cutting the grass or anything. So I don't know.
They had, in the Grace Episcopal Church Farm Day this year, they had it open for visitation.
Oh, that's good. I'm glad to hear that.
They have a new owner, and they.
Oh, good, good. Well, you can't really see it, but on the far side of the porch here, there's still the barred windows where you could ride up and pay for something. They would pass you a tankard or something through the barred windows.
I'm sorry, I was talking about Castle Hill.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. But that's in Boswell Tavern here. They did put a kitchen on the back, but the rest of the house, it's all the original wainscoting and the floors, and they have one room set aside as the Lafayette room. I don't know.
Why not?
Could be. So anyway, that you can actually see that, and there is kind of a safe little place to pull off right in front of it so that you can see it without. I don't know if I do it with a bus, but I would certainly do it there. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.